Very good evening to all my friends in India and greetings to Lisa Singh and friends who have logged in from other parts of the world. It gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Tamil Nadu Mediators and Conciliators Association. We are a non-profit organization functioning for over 6 years with the objective to promote and exchange information on mediation and other alternative dispute resolution methods. We have been actively involved in creating awareness on mediation within the state and outside as well. We are happy to host this online talk show in order to understand about community and court mediation in different countries. And this evening we have with us Lisa Singh, a renowned mediator with terrific work experience. Lisa Singh is a professional mediator, facilitator, coach, and intercultural trainer. Lisa's professional mediation experience dates to 1996 from a community mediation center, the Dayton Mediation Center. Since day one, she has been an active community mediator and volunteer. The Dayton Mediation Center handles a wide range of community issues, including court-initiated mediation, such as juvenile crime and child protection, adult court filings, first-time offense or early intervention to avoid court, divorce, small claims, civil cases, unruly behavior, elder care, landlord-tenant disputes, and several other areas. The Dayton Mediation Center, as a community mediation center, partners with the courts to provide early intervention services. They also provide facilitation services for the city to provide focus groups and other groups that help the city in their city planning as well as decision making. Although trained in several mediation models, Lisa loves the transformative model and has worked within this model to help people have more constructive mediations. Lisa studied psychology at the University of Illinois and intercultural communication for an MA at, I don't know whether I'm getting the pronunciation right, Antioch University, but she does not have a law degree, but was trained as a mediator through the Supreme Court of Ohio and the Supreme Court of Nebraska, and is recognized as a qualified mediator and works with mediators beyond borders and currently working on curriculum for a number of different projects in mediation. Yeah, so that's so much of Lisa. There's much more. I'm sure if she can share her website or LinkedIn profile, people could log in and get to read more about Lisa's work. The format for this evening is once Lisa's presentation is completed, we'll have a Q&A session. Friends could either raise their hands or key in their questions in the chat box, and we'll take it up from there. And towards the end, we'll have Sudarshana delivering the vote of thanks. So without much, people are all waiting in excitement and anticipation to hear more about community mediation from the US. And so over to you, Lisa, waiting to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for inviting me to this session. And it's such a pleasure and my pleasure to be able to meet with all of you and get to know all of a little bit about each one of you. Hopefully I'll learn something. I always like to learn as much as I can from everyone. So thank you. And I think, I think I want to start a little bit more with what's comfortable for me. And so I want to start with a question to all of you before I start with my PowerPoint, and that is, when you hear the word community mediation, what does it mean to you? So maybe 2 or 3 people could respond to that.
Anybody can.
Yes, don't be shy.
Community mediation. Can I say something, Kavita?
Yes, of course.
Lisa, community mediation could be Like, for example, within, it has different connotations over here as far as, I mean, to the best of my understanding. It could be people living in a community. It could be, for example, a particular area in a city. Like we have in Bangalore, at least, we have these big, uh, um communities consisting of about thousands of apartments. The residents have a lot of issues with each other, or with um about amenities provided, etc. That could be community. That is a sort of community. Then you have in India has such a vast diversity. It could be within a cultural sort of cultural differences between different communities in a particular state. I mean, these are some very basic examples I can think of. I mean, just off my head, Frank. So, I mean, in my view, that's what I could say.
To me,
Thank you.
community, when you ask the question as to what it means, a community, I feel it I don't look at it from a very elitist or a, upper middle class families, as we call it, but more from the grassroots workers, more from people who have civic issues, maybe the urban poor, the rural workers, or people like that who have issues and that which could be resolved. So to me, when you say community, for me it's the people, and it's not the people who have the privileges, who can resort to different ways of getting their things done, but it's people who are out there who do not have an opportunity to avail of several of the things. That's what community means to me.
And to
No, but
me,
community is got a very widespread meaning. No, community consists of lower, upper, everybody. So, irrespective of the fact that the slightly upper class do have, I totally agree with you, do have a lot of facilities available. But when it comes to, any kind of community mediation, it could be across the board, any part of the community, in my opinion, frankly speaking.
yeah, and for me, community mediation means it's a dispute or conflict among people who have common interest or
Yes.
something in common with them, and they share a relationship.
Hmm.
Those are meant like community disputes. It may be something they might have there must be a common interest or a
Yes.
shared interest, and something that is in dispute. That is what we are trying to resolve by community mediation.
Hmm. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think those are all good things. And I think from my perspective, community is what you define it as. It is that's how community mediation centers develop. And just as each person maybe have a different view of what a community mediation center is, in the US, my experience is that every community has a different approach to it because all communities are different. So I think you illustrated that very, very well in how you answered that question. So I think I'm going to sort of cover on how community mediation centers got started and some of the things that they do. And then we'll talk about, maybe if we have time, the wider issues. And hopefully I will stop for questions. So I'm going to share my screen because I have the crazy PowerPoint here someplace.
That's a green button.
No, I have the right button. I just have to, it just takes me time to find it. So, do you see the screen?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So, community mediation and court mediation, and I combined them. And in the US, really, as you're going to find out, the court and community mediation is very interwoven for a lot of reasons. So in the US, actually, mediation was introduced first, mediation in general, not community mediation, because there was a lot of social unrest during the 1900s. So at that time, it was during the Industrial Revolution. A lot was happening. There were a lot of changes in terms of the way of thought. In fact, there was a change from the gold standard to should we have coins in silver. Like that created even that dispute. And laborers felt like their wages were not increasing, and that made them very unhappy. So they took to the streets to protest. And then collective bargaining, actually from a woman named Betts in the UK, she developed a sort of a step stage for collective bargaining. And that was so successful that that led to mediation. In terms of mediation, was sort of modeled after that collective bargaining model that worked and that helped bridge the gap between laborers and the managers and owners of the companies. So because of that, there was a push that why don't we use mediation? And it was really popular for addressing these social issues. And then later on, it was sort of introduced to address some of the court issues because the courts felt overburdened, that especially because the US is probably one of the countries with the most, it's a very litigious society. And there's a tendency to just take everything to the courts because they'll settle it. There's a feeling that the court would be fair, and so that's the best place to take it. But what that does is because there's so many cases going, the court can only handle so much. So they have a tendency to want to then introduce mediation to relieve the number of cases that they get. And then community mediation itself was introduced in the 1960s, again, because of this civil rights movement. Social conflict, again, started coming out. There was the Vietnam War going on. There was the issues of prejudice and discrimination. And so all of those things led to a lot of civil unrest. And so I think that Community Mediation Center was formed to try to address some of those issues. The idea was that these things are happening in our communities. Let's start a center where we can bring mediators together. And I have to say that even right now, during the last election that we had in the US, Mediation Center stepped in, not only for that, there's a National Association for Community Mediation, and there's Mediators Beyond Borders. These two have joined hands, and we had a secret, not really secret, but we had a group of people, a network of mediators throughout the whole US. And what they would do is if there is a protest, they go down to the protest and they're trained and talk to the protesters to try to help unravel the conflicts that are happening especially during our election, because there was a lot of worry that some of the protests would get out of hand. So again, that surfaced that need for using people who can help you talk and can help, talk people out of violent conflict. Have become very important. So I think there's a strong bond between the need to quell the civil unrest and the need to use your community resources, your local resources, to help stem that tide. So that's when community mediation was introduced. And then throughout the 70s, it really became really, really popular. It worked so well that it was embraced. It started from Ohio, Atlanta, New York. There were several centers. And then the federal government actually introduced some mediation centers. They called them, I've forgotten, I think, I've forgotten the name of the centers, but they introduced 3 centers that were more wide ranging. And mainly what they looked at, and they always call it, rather they don't call them mediation centers, they called it alternative dispute resolution centers, because one of the things, and you'll see that in the US, community mediation centers are willing and excited to use any kind of model or any example that helps to deal with conflict. So you'll see restorative justice there, you'll see other models besides mediation. It's just that mediation is the main model for a lot of those centers. Ohio, in fact, I think I should say, was one of the places where mediation was adopted. There was a prosecutor, especially court mediation, because there was a prosecutor in Ohio who said, well, wait a minute, let's use mediation. And he introduced the idea. And then Ohio also was one of the first to provide funding. So the Supreme Court started a dispute resolution center in Ohio, and they provided funding for all of the different mediation centers. I know I particularly helped create the Ohio Community Mediation Association, and that was because of Ohio Supreme Court dollars. And the Ohio Supreme Court also provides free training for any of the community mediation center volunteers or members, so that you can get professional development at any time. So they provide those resources. So Ohio has been one of the really strong centers that have encouraged community mediation, and they believe in it. Another state which I have practiced in is Nebraska, and Nebraska has a different system totally from Ohio. In Nebraska, the Supreme Court is also involved, but they hand off the training and the responsibility. If you want to be a mediator in Nebraska, no matter who you are, you have to take the training through the Community Mediation Association in Nebraska, even if you're a private mediator. All the training is done through them, and let's say you're mediating in Ohio and you've mediated for 20 years. If you want to mediate in Nebraska, you still have to take that training. And so community mediation in Nebraska is really molding the field, because they introduce people to the field of mediation. And what a lot of people do, especially beginning mediators, is they volunteer with the centers to get experience before they become private practitioners, so that they're not just taking training and going out and trying to do it. They actually then use the community mediation centers as a way to gather experience. So that's the way it works in Nebraska. And then each area, what Nebraska has done is carve out different regions. And I was director of one of the regional mediation centers. And so in that region, you get, that you're responsible for everything that happens in that region. And our region, because it's not a very populated state, so our region had about 4 counties. It was a pretty long drive to some of those mediations. So that's a little bit about those two. In terms of court mediation, like I said, it's very strongly connected because of the prosecutor in Ohio, and because the Ohio court system promotes community mediation, but also the cities and the counties do. The Dayton Mediation Center, for instance, is was started or funded by the city of Dayton. So that it's a city organization. A lot of other mediation centers in the U.S. are nonprofit organizations and not connected to a city other than the relationships that they have built. So I think the Dayton Mediation Center is a little unique in that it is one of the few that is actually funded by the city. So I think I mentioned this. Okay, I already talked about this one about the Supreme Court. So a little bit about the other models that they use, because restorative justice is also popular amongst all of the communities, and that's because the idea of restorative justice is that the community is affected by crime. So this started as a result of seeing the effects of crime on a community. For example, if somebody commits a crime in your apartment building, then what happens in the apartment building is everybody starts locking their doors and being very suspicious of anybody who walks by, and that creates disharmony within the community. And so it's not that you just have a victim and an offender, but the whole community then is affected by a crime. So restorative justice says, why don't we take all of the legs and all of the voices of the community, the victim, the offender, and the community, and involve them in the whole process. So they use processes like circles. A circle process is one. They use family group decision-making, like if there is a family and it's not just the husband and wife who are having the problems and they take the child away. In the U.S., we tend to take children away from parents who are abusive. And so instead of just saying the husband and the wife and the child, why not involve the whole family? Why not get the family involved to give support to the families who are having these behaviors so that they can change their behaviors and give the child a better foundation? So that family group decision-making model is from New Zealand. So we are really, really happy to take any model that works from anywhere in the world. The circle process itself is a Native American process. And that's where everyone sits in a circle and the whole discussion, everyone is equal, and the discussion goes around the circle so everyone has a voice. So that's a little bit about the restorative justice techniques, but you can't talk about a mediation center, a community mediation center in the U.S., I think, without mentioning restorative justice techniques as well. So I decided to find out, who refers things to the Community Mediation Center. So there's a long list here, and I should send you the PowerPoint, but I don't think I can list all of them. But this is from the National Association for Mediation, and they took a survey and found out where all of the community mediation centers in the U.S. get their referrals. So the local district courts, attorneys, mental health clinicians, therapists. I'm not going to read the whole list. Anyway, you can see it's a very extensive list of places that refer to community mediation centers. And I think, our concept of community mediation is very broad. It's not just the neighborhood, because there's neighbor to neighbor conflicts. There's what's happening in the neighborhood, but also businesses. Businesses are part of our community, our fabric. Government is part of the fabric of the community. And so courts are part of the fabric of the community. So you can't talk about community mediation without talking about the broader issues in community mediation. The most cases that are referred are like self-referrals. So those are really big. They're the number one. I mean, a lot of people will call and say, hey, I'm having a conflict, and they like to go to their community mediation center. Court programs, again, like I said, you can't talk about community mediation without talking about the courts. I think community mediation centers in general handle a lot of the community disputes, ones that people want to bring, but also some of the lower, like victim offender, with the juveniles. Juvenile programs are also part of that, where we believe that mediation can be a way to keep juveniles out of going to jail or out of getting into problems. So they're really deterrents. We get also cases of truancy. If kids skip school, there's a law in the US that children have to go to school so many days in the year, and if they skip out of school, it gets referred to the courts. So rather than take them to the courts, they use community mediation centers to talk to the families about what's going on with the child. So that's one of the examples, but those come from the courts as well. Government agencies, again, government agencies like to use the community mediation centers. At the Dayton Mediation Center, because it's also city-owned, they use the mediation center to help in the strategic planning. They help. They use the mediation center to not only that, but like neighborhood, or like we've had businesses which they call good neighbor agreements. So there are some businesses where the neighbors are complaining about the business. For instance, the little corner store, all the neighbors were upset because they felt like too many kids were hanging in around, and they were worried that maybe drugs were being sold in this small store, and they were upset with the owners that it wasn't being addressed. So the community and the store owners came together and created an agreement with the store owners that they would, tell the children to go home, or they would, I think there were about 3 or 4 things that the store owner agreed to do. And then they agreed that they would contact some of the older members of the community so that they would reduce the things that were happening. Another neighborhood agreement was a business that wanted to be established in the community, but it was a drug treatment center. And the community members did not want a drug treatment center in their community. And so we brought the community together to talk about how that could be addressed, and to start, interacting with the business owners so that community center could, so that drug treatment center could be located there. As it turned out, that did not work out, and the drug treatment center withdrew and found another location. But the community members had a voice in that business, and I think that was what was important, and that's why the government wanted the mediation center to be involved. Nonprofits, very big. In fact, one of the community mediation centers we had said they really got a lot of nonprofits, even with their board. Their boards sometimes have problems and communication problems, and that's a big place where community mediation centers help, because they can be more effective if they can communicate well. Legal services organizations, we get things from the legal aid and law, where this is something that they can't really service, or maybe someone doesn't have enough money, so they will refer a case to the community mediation center. Attorneys also are a big source of, in fact, some attorneys they like to use mediation because so we do get a lot of attorney referrals. Then the school system, we do mediation. In fact, with a lot of mediation centers, help with peer mediation, teaching kids in the school how to mediate and helping them to mediate each other's problems. So we work and teach students how to do that, and work with the school system and training the parents and informing them. So that's also very popular. And housing, because landlord-tenant is kind of one of the big issues. So those are the major issues that come in the U.S. In fact, 66. And again, these statistics are all from the National Association for Community Mediation. So volunteers is one thing. The community mediation centers use volunteers. What they're looking for, one of their philosophies, is to find members of the community are the best. The best to mediate a problem are people that look like you or people that are part of your community. So any range of people, we get people who want to be volunteers from all socioeconomic classes in the U.S., and they're welcome as volunteers. Most of the volunteers do not get paid. Some of them get paid, especially if they're doing more complex mediations. Then a lot of centers will pay them an honorarium. But every mediation center, again, is different, and the cases that they handle are different, so it depends on how they operate. I know in Nebraska, we gave honorariums to mediators who did family group conferences, or we gave honorariums to other mediators. So there was a pool of private mediators who also did that. And the Dayton Mediation Center refers to private mediators. So I get referrals for my private practice from the Dayton Mediation Center as well. So it kind of, that there's a bond between that private and public service. But funding is the big thing. Where's the funding coming from? Because right now, you see a lot of centers are struggling with funding, and they can't operate unless they can get the dollars. So a lot of the funding has traditionally come from the government, from the state governments or the federal government. They have grant programs that mediation centers can apply for. That was one of my skills, was being able to write a grant to the government. So let's see, somebody called me in the middle of this and I lost my thought. But that is not the only source. Others are very successful at finding community members who are willing to support them and donate dollars. And I have always said that if you are nonprofit, and this is something that I promoted, is that you should have a stream of funders, because if you can get 80% from a stream of funders, you don't need to rely on grants. And it's not good to rely on grant funding. But that's me. That's because, it is just a better way to get your funding. Some of the centers also fund themselves by taking some of their services and actually charging for them. Like in Nebraska, the family group decision-making model was charged, I think we charged $3,000 to the Children's Services program, and that funded the centers actually, because they got enough of those cases to fund their operations. So that's just an example of how centers are funded. And I think every community, again, that it's different, but how you find funding sources is also different. It's a struggle sometimes. Again, every center has different rules, and some, only will service the geographical area. The city of Dayton, for instance, will service anybody in the city of Dayton, can have those services for free because it's operated and owned by the city. But outside the city, they accept cases, but they'll charge you if you live outside the city. And they charge on a sliding scale, so that if you don't have the funding, you pay less, but if you have money, then you pay more. But it's also an honorary system, so, you know, if you say you're poor, then we'll believe you. That's the way it works. That's an example for that. Other centers have other ways that they handle that. And then again, I think I mentioned the Association for Community Mediation. So different states have an association. I started the one in Ohio because I was the consultant that worked with the Dayton Mediation Center to start our Ohio Center. There's one in Nebraska and other states, but there's also the National Association for Community Mediation, and most of the community mediation centers are members of that, and they're a very active network. I mentioned who could be a mediator, so I'm not going to mention again. Like, anybody can be a mediator. We do find that people take the training. Some people stick with it and get really excited about it. Others kind of disappear, and we figure that's fine. You know, they self-identify if that's something that they're going to be good at. It's very rare that a mediator is asked not to mediate. It has happened. Some volunteers get fired, but in general, most of the time, 95% of the time, most of the people who come forward are good at it. So the other thing is the models, and I think the mediation centers, especially community mediation centers in the US, are very excited about the transformative. I started with a facilitative model in 1996, and then when the Dayton Mediation Center transformed to a transformative model in 97 or 98, we were one of the first to adopt it. And right now, the Dayton Mediation Center actually runs the Institute for Conflict Transformation, which is the driver of transformative mediation. So we are heavily involved with that, the Institute, in terms of the mediation model. And the reason that we like that model, community mediation centers like that model, is it's more relational, it's more about relationships, and it's less about you should get an agreement, and more about what is your communication and how you communicate. So that's one of the reasons that the centers like it. So now I can take questions. Oh, yay, I'm in the question phase. And I think you had mentioned, I said about, stop the share, yes. You had mentioned about environmental conflicts, so I have to at least touch on a couple. So within the Community Mediation Center, one of the environmental conflicts was there was a spill. One of the, not companies, but one of the major companies had an environmental spill that got into the water system in the city. And so the Environmental Protection Agency, the federal government's agency, came in and worked with the Dayton Mediation Center, and we went into the community, and what we did was have a series of conversations with the community. We had members from the EPA who informed them, told them, you know, how dangerous it was, what they had to do. And then we listened to the community, because the important thing is the community needed to express its dissatisfaction, its anger, and that listening also helped the EPA find out, you know, what else can they do differently. Similar thing happened because there was a facility the south of the city of Dayton, and this was actually before I was in the mediation center that it started. but one of the environmental companies was working on a cleanup, and the people were very concerned about the nuclear energy. I mean, because it had been a nuclear power plant, and so people were concerned about that in the neighborhood. So we did focus groups with small members of the community to determine how are we going to recapture that site or re-innovate that area, because now it was closed. The community needed to be involved with decisions about that and be assured that they would be safe and they wouldn't have to worry about a spill. So that's a couple of examples. I'm also working with Mediators Beyond Borders to talk about policy, and we are helping to develop some of the policy initiatives for the United Nations. So that's it. Okay. Now ask me a question.
Lisa, I have two questions, both from the same person, a senior mediator. And the first one is, how is voluntariness impacted in court-mandated mediation? That's one. And the second one is, how are integrity and neutrality affected in community mediation? I think we'll go with these two first, and maybe others
Okay.
can pitch in
So
later.
we have found that the volunteer mediators have been well respected by the courts. And sometimes some of the judges have been suspicious in the beginning. To be quite frank, they've been resistant. But once they have adopted and used the volunteer mediators, they have become advocates for our process. So I think that when they see that it's effective and that the volunteers are doing a good job, it doesn't matter anymore. I think the proof comes out in seeing the product. And I think as a mediation center, we really rely on training our volunteers. So I should say what I'm required to do as a volunteer, even though I've been mediating for 20 years, the requirements for me as a volunteer are very strict. I have to agree to one professional development training a month. That's 3 hours at least. I have to agree to volunteer for 2 mediations, and I have to volunteer to go to some other a training at least once a quarter, every 3 months. And if I don't do that, then I will not be able to maintain myself as a volunteer in the center. And when I became a volunteer, I had to not only take the training, I took the training, and then I had to go through a process where I co-mediated with a mediator. Well, first, the process is you observe mediations first before you even mediate. Then you co-mediate with someone who has experience. And then you mediate with somebody who has experience who can also observe. So we use this co-mediation model, and we use this process, and then you are not certified as a mediator with the Dayton Mediation Center until I think it takes about 6 months to be certified, because you have to go through this process and additional training before they actually give you the certificate. So I think this is one of the reasons why the courts trust the volunteer mediators, because they're seeing that they're and then they don't even do some of the court cases until they've shown that they have the expertise. So we're kind of strict. It's not so easy to volunteer. So what was the second question?
How are integrity and neutrality affected in community mediation?
So, okay, so integrity is one thing. We just expect that people will be transparent and honest. And one of the things is, for instance, a big issue is that that you shouldn't mediate with anyone that you know. If I know one of the parties, I have to recuse myself from mediating because I might be biased towards the person I know. Or even if I'm not biased, the perception of bias could be there. Now, there is an exception to that, and this is actually in the Uniform Mediation Act and in the law. But exception is if all of the parties agree, because it may be that they know that you're neutral or all the parties know you. And if they agree, then that's all right. And then neutrality itself, the transformative model says it's probably impossible to be totally neutral. I mean, this is something that Ken Cloak also says, because we have biases, we have issues, and I think it's one of the reasons we like the transformative model, because a transformative model says, I'm not going to direct where you're going to be. I'm not going to direct what you want to do in the mediation. Instead, I'm going to follow the party's lead. And by following their lead and they decide what they want to talk about, they decide how they want to talk, they make a lot of the decisions in the process, which is different than the facilitative model where the mediator directs the process. In my opinion, it's a lot harder to do transformative and it takes a lot more skill. But I feel like in many ways, it's a lot more ethical because the parties drive what is going to be discussed and how it's going to be discussed. So that's how we take care of those issues, and why we chose that model, in fact, is for those reasons.
Any further questions? I don't find any questions in the chat box. Anybody wants to ask Lisa on anything else?
Ask a crazy fun question.
Mm-hmm.
Can you give me some mediation which you did, community mediation, some mediation which you can disclose to us, which you thought was very interesting and it was something that you'd cherished all your mediation career? Some example.
Well, one example that I often tell everybody, but just because it was so interesting, there are two actually. The one that was very interesting was the mayor of the city does a walk through the community. And when she did the walk through the community, there was a house who had some exotic birds. They had parrots and cockatoos and a whole lot of them. And as she was walking by, all the neighbors were saying, that neighbor is such a problem because those birds are noisy. We can't stand the noise of those birds. And so the mayor decided to take this to mediation. So the community members came, and the woman who had the parrots brought her parrot to be a part of the mediation. So during the mediation, the parrot was walking back and forth. And I don't know what it was saying. It was squawking a lot. And I always found that was a very, very interesting one. I think some of the ones where I've gotten concerned was and this is where issues come in. There was a small case where someone was doing a telephone harassment, where they call someone up and they were saying lewd things to these women in the household. And this man tried to use the mediation to get to get their new telephone number. So I don't think that's okay. But we have to be really careful sometimes when we do something like that. It's a victim offender, and then we have to go through a special process. Like I will hold the man back first and let the victim leave first so that they can get out safely. Or in this case, we let him leave first and then held them back because, they felt like that would be better if he leaves first. So we'll do things like that to try to make sure that they can get away, and there's no further issues. So those are two. I'm probably have a whole lot more.
Can
But people, how
Pardon
do
me?
you how do you get those parties to get down to the mediation process as such? You're talking about community where there is a voluntariness and people. How do you make them come into this mediation? Because in India, this seems to be a greatest problem of making parties to come into mediation and settle the matters. Although they know that it can be settled, but still there is a
Yeah. We had that problem in the U.S. In fact, I wrote this grant and got this victim offender mediation program started, and then I was leading the program and managing the program. Couldn't get any victims to come to the table. They're like, no way. And actually, that's how I got into restorative justice, because I was trying to get the victims to the table, and I said, what can I do better? So I went to Minnesota, where they were successful at it, and I discovered restorative justice techniques there. But one thing they taught me that was so important, that when you are talking to the victim or when you are talking, you do more listening than talking. And that once you have listened, sometimes you have to listen for half an hour and use all of your listening skills. Don't insist that they come to mediation, just listen. And after 15 or 20 minutes of listening to their concerns, they often change, and then they're willing to come to the table. So initially they'll just say, no, no way. But if you can have them talk about what are your concerns, what are you feeling, and then at the end of that, they often will change their mind and decide to come to mediation. So we have to use our skills. Sometimes it's hard for me because I like to talk.
Anybody else? Okay, can you were mentioning about mediators without borders, Lisa. Yeah, so does it mean like intercountry, or how do they work? I know we've heard of lawyers without borders, doctors without borders. Well, at least for me, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. So, I mean, that's very interesting. I'm sure all my friends here too would like to be part of it, or maybe take it forward.
Yes, I would highly recommend it. We have in the U.S. we have the Association for Conflict Resolution, and as it was growing and really becoming very popular, there were also a lot of international mediators who would come. And then I think Ken Cloak was one. There were several who wanted to start the whole idea of going and leaving the U.S. and doing mediation, providing these services worldwide. And that's how Mediators Beyond Borders got started, as an offshoot or part of the Association for Conflict Resolution. And then it grew and blossomed over the years, and really has become a very big driving force throughout the whole world. So I have found that it provides a lot of opportunities, and it's opened some doors for me. So I like, being a member, and being an active member, because it keeps me active. I've gotten training, and I've gotten some other professional opportunities. So for me, I like it. I don't know if everyone else does, but anyway, I do.
Lisa, can you tell us something about the agreements that you enter upon? After the settlement, there's an agreement. Can you tell us?
Yeah, so agreements, okay, maybe you should state the question again, so I want to make sure that I understand it fully.
Yeah, how do you make agreements, mediation settlement agreements?
So one of the things, because in the beginning, I remember we tried to use it and make it sound so so that it sounded like, a legal agreement. But we have grown away from that now. What we like to do is just use the words of the parties, because they're more likely, the more it's their words, the more likely they are to adhere to it. And if it's a court mediation, we let the courts take those words. And a lot of times now the courts are in agreement, like, okay, that's what they agree to. They may change it slightly to fit what has to be legal, but they generally take that because the spirit of that agreement is what's important. I am one of the few mediators that I will offer the parties the opportunity to write their part of the agreement themselves rather than write it for them, because it's amazing. I can tell you, I remember I did a juvenile agreement, and the juvenile said very little. His parents did all of the talking. And we thought, well, okay, the parents are doing the talking. They've come to an agreement with both sides. And in the very end, the juvenile took the piece of paper and wrote an apology on the piece of paper. And what he wrote, was so meaningful that I could never have written it as well as he did. And though he didn't say anything, we got a lot more out of that agreement than we ever would have if I'd written it. Although I give the parties that choice, so I will write it for them. And if I'm doing a private mediation, I have boilerplate language if I need it. So, does that help?
Yeah.
Very much, very much. And
Talking
what in case they don't agree to the settlement? What happens when they don't do things what they have agreed? There's a default.
Yeah, we have found, because we've done research on when we do a follow-up call with many of our cases several months later. And we have found that 85% of the time, if they have really created the agreement, in fact, we have, good statistics for that they generally follow up. In the case that they don't, if it's a court-mandated mediation, they have the option to take it back to court and that's written in the agreement, and they can always go back to the court. I think that's what we do. Sometimes we have mediated agreements that have broken up a second time, and after the second time it's worked, so that's another option. So we leave all of those options on the table.
Thank you.
And we also do not, in the transformative model, we are more about the communication. So I'm going to say that we've had some mediations not end in an agreement. However, because the parties were listened to, they often, and we have statistics on this as well, they sometimes resolve the conflict themselves later because they're not as angry, they don't feel it. And so even if we don't get an agreement may arise.
That's nice.
Thank
Can
you,
you
Lisa.
juvenile? You were talking about juvenile references.
Yes.
Juvenile. What sort of a reference you get in the community centers? Is it through court, or how do you get those references?
Well, we can get them through all of the resources, because it could be, just the schools can send them, but we do get court mandated mediation, and the way that it works is it is a way to keep them out of from having to go to jail, because once they get this on their record, that's not good. So what they do is we call them diversion cases, so that their intention is to divert them from the court, and especially if it's first offense. So we get all first offense cases are sent to mediation. I do want to say that when something is mandated by the court, one of the rules that we use, and this is agreed on by the courts, is that if you come for the mediation and you decide not to go forward, you have met the court mandate. You don't have to mediate. We really feel that mediation has to be voluntary. And so this is the way that we keep the voluntariness of the mediation, but also meet the court mandate. So we get things like criminal menacing, we get family mediation where families, maybe unruly children, they're running away, they're not behaving properly. We get a wide range of cases, mostly for juveniles. I mean, in general, it's the kids get upset because they heard that somebody said something to somebody else's friend, and then they get in a fight and they and sometimes it's amazing when they start to talk it through, like, wow, I didn't know that.
There's a question continuing on children. There's one question that's come up which says, like, what if children skip school? Would that be taken up as a community problem, and is community mediation possible in such cases?
Yes, we do that. I mean, in fact, that was something I think I brought out earlier, because it's called truancy. So when they skip a certain amount, the law says you have to go to school so many days in the year. And if you skip, I think they have a whole series of numbers of days. And if you skip those days, the first thing you'll get is a warning. And then the second thing is, it goes up to that. We tend to get the mediations after the first warning. Then they're sent to the mediation center, and we go to the schools and talk to the parents and the child and the school officials in a conference. And that often helps. Sometimes you find some sad things, because I know one case, a child wasn't going to school because his mother was sick, and he would hide under the bed to be able to stay home because he was so worried about his mother. And she didn't actually realize how worried he was about her. And so the culmination of that mediation had a lot more to do with, how they could help so that he wouldn't have to feel that way and he wouldn't have to skip school.
I think it's going to be 9 here, and
Yes, I was.
yeah, you're going to have a long day as well. So if that's, end of the Q&A session, maybe I'll hand it over to Sudarshana, who will give us the vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Selvi. It has been a great pleasure. I mean, it was quite interesting and informal, as you put it. It was totally, we did not know that time was passing off, and it's almost 9 o'clock, almost bedtime for us. And thank you so much for eliciting what is community mediation, because we in India, it is very formative, because we do have little community mediation here and there, but not as in a big way. I think in India, where population is so much and there is multicultural, racial, I think community mediation should start off. So thank you so much for giving a bird's eye view and also individually answering us the questions with patience. I think we'll have to call you back for environmental mediation also. I think that should be because we are also interested in that. So that, because environmental issues are also in the upcoming and all that. Thank you so much, and thank you all for participating. Thank you.
Thank you.